Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be asking the important question, remembering God on Remembrance Day, and as we remember the great sacrifice that was made for this nation made during the First and the Second World Wars, it's important to remember God's providence and his hand on our nation during our dark hours during the First and the Second World War, and particularly marks a brand new book that has been published called Beyond the Odds, and I've got it here, and we'll be talking through some of the amazing and incredible miracles that took place during the First and the Second World War. So to join me in this programme, I'm joined by one of the authors, Tim Dieppe from Christian Concern, together with Hugh Kitson from Whose Land. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Firstly, I'll start off with you, Tim. I mean, I'm very excited by this book because I think it's so needed in a sense that so much of our military history books have been written from a secular perspective and haven't included the kind of divine interventions, that when the nation during the First and the Second World War called for national days of prayer, the nation would be at prayer. When we faced absolute catastrophes at Dunkirk and also the Battle of Britain and also D-Day as well, that this is a timely reminder that God is sovereign in human history and that we need his help. What inspired you and also John Striven to write this extraordinary, detailed and factual book marking God's intervention during the First and the Second World Wars?
Well, thank you, Simon. I think it's exactly what you said, really, that I think too much historians and history tend to airbrush God out of the picture as if there's no role for God and no role for prayer. And of course, I see history as like his story, ultimately, right? And we've got to see God in the mix of it. And like you watch the film Dunkirk, and it's like there's no prayer, it's like nobody prayed, it's like they're trying to airbrush that all out as if that didn't happen, it didn't matter. When for the nation at the time, there was a national day of prayer, huge numbers turned up to pray. Local churches, newspaper reports say the biggest numbers ever turned up to those services to pray. And when the deliverance happened, the politicians and the generals all said, this is a miracle, this is an answer to prayer. And I think this is the kind of thing that we need to get back into, a perspective of history, that what is God's role in it? And the people at the time had a faith, they saw it as important, they prayed, and they saw answers to their prayers.
Absolutely. And Hugh, you've made a number of different films through Whose Land to God's Blessing or Curse or Coincidence, those series of films that you've done through Hatikva Films. And you know very, very well, particularly God's intervention in human history, but also the curses that God brings about if you curse the people of Israel and the Jewish people. And we saw that during the Mandate years of the British Mandate, as well as Israel's war for independence and right up to the modern times. What was your perspective when it comes of God's intervention, particularly when it comes to a series of crises, when our freedoms, our democracy, our very way of life is under threat?
Well, first of all, I think that Britain had a unique role going back 100 years and even further from the time of the Reformation onwards. We were, in one sense, the flag bearer of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And one of the unique things, too, that the Lord gave us a sort of Cyrus calling to be the facilitator of the restoration of Israel. So our destiny was very much tied up with that, going back 100 years or so. And very sadly, we betrayed that and we've suffered as a result.
And Tim, I know we can go back 100 years earlier to the First World War and think of the Napoleonic Wars, and again we see the Battle of Waterloo, God's intervention on the side of the British to keep Europe from becoming a United States of Europe led by Napoleon, and the Battle of Waterloo was nothing but an absolute miracle and divine intervention. What is it about this nation, do you think, that God regards different from other nations, that we have been the protector of liberty? This nation, the gospel has gone throughout the four corners of the earth because of this nation. What do you think makes it special about our nation, that we're an island, and that God has got a particular call upon our nation that he doesn't have like other nations?
Well, I can only put it down really to the response to the gospel when it came to these shores, and also the Reformation effect that had, and the people who were studying the Bible and wanted to get back to biblical Christianity at the time, and then the fact that people prayed. And people then acted on their prayers as well. And I think the only reason we can look at these things here is because people prayed. And God's grace is because people prayed. God's favour is because people prayed. And people really did pray in those times. The population going to church was very high. The population going to Sunday schools was very, very high back in the 1940s and the 1920s and 30s and so on. And so they really did pray. And the question is now, where now for Britain? Because most people aren't praying anymore. And where will that go? But I think because people prayed, because people wanted to advance the gospel, we saw the abolition of slavery as well, all these other things. We have had a massive impact on the world, and it is incredible. But it's by grace, and it's only because people prayed.
Absolutely. And Hugh, there's an interesting quote in one of the war films I like called Fury, and this is the story set in 1945, in April 1945, when the American forces entered Germany and faced the kind of harsh resistance in Germany. And there's a quote when a new recruit is joined this tank crew, and they say to him that there are no atheists in foxholes. So in other words, that in the midst of battle, when it's a matter of life and death, you won't find many atheists. How important is it, for example, that today's armed forces as well just acknowledge God's hand of history upon our nation as we remember those that were fallen as we mark Remembrance Day?
I think it's absolutely vital. And I think it's very sad that the number of Christian soldiers these days is much fewer than it has been in the past. And yet there are some very fine Christian men and Christian leaders within the armed forces. And I believe we're going to hear about one or two of them a bit later on.
Absolutely. Well, we'll do it now, shall we? Let's have a look at this excellent trailer for Beyond the Odds, a new book that's been written by Tim Dieppe and also John Skirvin.
At 9:30 a.m. on 18th May, Rees Howes wrote in his diary, "Unless God intervenes today in a miraculous way, I believe we are lost." Beyond the Odds is about key turning points in the First and Second World Wars, when Britain was saved from disaster and in some cases national catastrophe in circumstances that defied probabilities, hence the title Beyond the Odds. As it was to do so, on more than one occasion during the war, the weather saved the British Army. Brooke wrote afterwards, "What might have happened if the Germans had attacked before the winter makes me shudder to think."
The title Beyond the Odds is trying to say, look, in these wars, in these battles, things happen that are kind of like extraordinary. And even today, some of these things are somewhat unexplained. The extent to which lots of things happen in conjunction and by chance, so to speak. But can you really say it's just by chance? If you factor in God, you wouldn't say that. And then you start to think, well, maybe it was prayer after all. And that's the idea behind Beyond the Odds. Reading his Bible by candlelight, the brigade major remembered the name of the place from 1 Samuel, chapters 13 and 14. He read that Jonathan had gone through a narrow pass between two sharp rocks to gain the higher ground where he had surprised the Philistines. Scouts were sent out and the pass was identified, thinly held by the Turks. The plan of attack was changed, and at night one infantry company was sent up through the pass. The Turks thought they were surrounded and fled, and so, concluded Major Gilbert, after thousands of years, British troops successfully copied the tactics of Saul and Jonathan.
Beyond the Odds is definitely a book that I've enjoyed reading. I mean, I am a military historian and I like reading well-researched and well-presented analysis. But what he's adding to this is a dimension that most, if not, well, yeah, certainly most, if not all the other military historians never really even take into consideration, which is the impact of people's personal Christian faith and the impact of godly intervention into these events.
For me, and I think Tim as well, the context is important to understand the nature of the events. So what was the background to the events? Why were they significant? How likely were they? It's those kind of questions I think you can only look at when you look at the full history.
It's a history book, and I think it will be anybody who's interested in history, who likes reading about particularly military history, World War I, World War II, that sort of thing, will find it interesting, and will find it's giving a different perspective to the kind of history that you normally read on these things.
The bottom line is, it's a book that I've enjoyed reading. I'm actually going to read it again. I know I will refer back to it in the future in various different ways. Particularly, I preach every year on Remembrance Sunday, for example. So some of the stories and some of the examples are there to be used and to be useful in discussions with people.
Such a timely and important book. Tim, I want to thank you for writing this book, because I've
only wrote 2 chapters, Sam.
The chapter on Malta and
Yes.
Churchill's Christianity, absolutely, and John Scruven deserves a huge amount of credit for actually writing this book. And for me personally, I mean, the last 20 years I've been, if not more, inspired by books about God's interventions in during the First World War and the Second World War and other major conflicts.
Yes.
And what it does is shows how sovereign God is. As you say early in the beginning, history is his story. Can you share with us one of the stories during the First World War, the Angels of Mons, because that was such an incredible story.
Yes, and it's one that people have forgotten and don't know about, and somehow it's gone out of our collective memory as a nation and even as a church. You know, people don't know about these stories. There are lots of stories of angels throughout history, and even many people, I've met people today who have met angels or seen angels and that kind of thing. And these angels, these accounts are around Mons, around that area. At the time of the First World War, the British troops were very thinly spread, and the line was very thinly held. And there are remarkable stories of them going out and the Germans fleeing. And then when the Germans are interviewed, why did you flee? They dropped their weapons and everything. Well, you know, how can we not flee from this great massive army that wasn't actually there? Or from an angel. Some of them said, we saw this great big angel. How can we not flee from that? And some of the British troops even saw angels fighting alongside them, or heard sounds of troops that weren't visible fighting behind them. And John has collected all of these accounts, all of these documentary accounts, and referenced them and shown them. And they are remarkable stories. And I think that, you know, we know that angels are around. They are involved in our lives, most often invisible, but sometimes visible. And I think that perhaps there really were angels fighting alongside our troops in some of those places in the First World War, and it's good to remember that and recognise that here we are on Remembrance Day, remembering God's role as well in the things that happened.
Absolutely. And Hugh, it's also important to remind ourselves that both the First World War and also the Second World War were also very much just wars. We faced the threat of German imperialism across the continent of Europe, and had the Germans not been stopped, they would have definitely taken over France and Belgium and Netherlands, and then became a threat to Britain. And of course, then we know of the Nazi ideology of the Nazis, who completely wanted to destroy the Jewish communities right across Europe and completely control and dominate the world. So here we are. In a sense, this is a battle, 2 battles between good and evil, and at stake was actually the freedom to spread the gospel and have the gospel go out to the 4 corners of the earth.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. If I can just take up something. You were talking about prayer a little bit earlier, Tim,
yes.
And John, in that video clip, he mentioned Rhys Howells, and he was principal of the Bible College of Wales. And during the years of the Second World War, they couldn't send their missionaries out. And so they all stayed there at the Bible college, and that Bible college became a real prayer house in a remarkable way. And I remember some years ago visiting the Bible College of Wales, and in particular the room where they met for prayer. And I went there with Lance Lambert, and it was just amazing because God was giving them intelligence about certain things to pray into, and there was absolutely no way that they could have known this, because I mean it was top secret. And so they were praying into specific events where they were given a word of knowledge from the Lord. And so prayer was absolutely vital in winning some of these battles. Not only Dunkirk, not only D-Day.
And then they would sense the victory at exactly the right time.
Yes.
You know, they would sense they've won the victory in prayer, and the next day they'd read in the papers, at that time when they sensed the victory, that was when the victory was won. Yeah. Right? So this is the kind of thing that happened with Rees Howells praying, and we've got these stories in this book, remarkable prayer. And the battle, think of Exodus 17, right? Where was the battle most won? It was Moses up on the hill, wasn't it, praying?
Absolutely.
That was where the battle was most fought. And so I think Rees Howells was fighting just as much, if not more, than the soldiers and other people praying as well. That was where the battle was really won.
Absolutely, because it was against principalities and powers of darkness. And of course, because also it's important to remember that particularly during the Second World War, that Hitler and the Nazis and the SS in particular used the occult in order to gain a spiritual advantage over the nations they would attack. So they would carry out some occultic practices before they'd invade, for like example, the Netherlands or Belgium. So those principalities and powers of darkness would come in first, and then you'd have the ground troops and the blitzkrieg that would actually follow. But I suppose if we look and draw from your book, Beyond the Odds, the one particular story that comes to mind more than any other, and you mentioned at the beginning of the program, is Dunkirk. And my grandfather was also stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk. So to actually think of the desperate situation that our armed forces were in, they had nowhere to turn. They were surrounded by the Nazis, and the miracles that took place at Dunkirk were extraordinary.
It is.
And that testifies to the hand of God. I mean, for example, there was a heavy rain storms in Belgium where the German Luftwaffe was. They couldn't take off, so they couldn't attack the troops. The Nazi Panzer Division stopped. And they didn't halted by Hitler himself. So that's a massive strategic mistake to allow the Luftwaffe to take them out, and then they couldn't fly. And then to have the stillness of the waters, never been as calm across the English Channel, allowing all these riverboats and cruise ships to rescue the 340,000. At most, I think Churchill believed he could get 40,000 troops out, which would have absolutely decimated.
Left us with no real army. No real army at all.
We've been at the mercy of Hitler.
And then, they could easily have invaded and just taken us over because there'd be no army to fight.
But can you explain to us the role of the king here? Because it wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury who called for a national day of prayer and repentance, but it was actually the king that led that. And what does this show us about godly leadership when we need it the most?
Yeah, well, you're right, Simon. It was the king that did it. It wasn't either the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Prime Minister, actually. Each time it was the king that called for a national day of prayer. And you've got to value that. He did it out of a genuine humility of, unless God is with us, what hope is there? Unless God is with us. And a genuine, and we need God. We can't do it without God either. And let's humbly present ourselves to God and humbly pray and seek his mercy and seek his help for our nation at this time. And yes, what remarkable leadership and what power there was. And there was multiple. We've got an appendix in this book of each of the days of prayer that were called throughout the First and Second World Wars. And there's many more than you sometimes think there were that were called. But it's not just him as well, it's the response, right? The response of the people across the nation who had a Christian faith or had at least a residual Christian faith around. And many, many people did and recognized humbly, we need to seek God. That humility of we can't do it on our own, we need God's help as well, that was there, that I think caused God to respond and answer those heartfelt prayers.
Another case, I mean, it was desperate times during May, June, August and September of 1940. Of course, we just mentioned Dunkirk in May of 1940. And also there was the Battle of Britain. And Churchill himself said, never has so much been owed to so many by so few, referring to the Royal Air Force and the Battle of Britain. And there we saw God's intervention because of the introduction of radar, could monitor the Luftwaffe coming over the channel, which gave time for the Spitfires and the Hurricanes to actually intercept the German Air Force. But what's extraordinary is the fact that the Germans didn't recognise the importance of radar and so therefore didn't target the radar stations. Again, is this another sign of God's incredible providence in our nation's history?
Absolutely, it really is. I think one of the things that's not generally recognised was that certainly Hitler was an antichrist figure, and the Battle of Britain was absolutely vital, because otherwise, as Tim said, the Nazis would have just come in and taken over the nation, and that would have been the end, I do believe. Another very important aspect, and we wouldn't have been at the Battle of El Alamein had the Battle of Britain not been won in the summer and autumn of 1940. Hitler was intent on extending his final solution to wipe out the Jews of the Middle East, and in particular what was then Palestine, today the land of Israel. And so again, the Battle of El Alamein was absolutely crucial in stopping him from doing that.
And also the first major defeat by the Germans during the Second World War.
Yeah.
The other issue I want to bring up really is also the D-Day preparations and the intercession and the prayer and the National Day of Prayer that went behind that, because we're talking about the biggest military operation in human history to liberate first France and then the rest of Europe of Nazi tyranny. Not only was it a major feat in logistics, but also the fact that they wanted to hide this from the Germans and therefore kind of faked
doing deceptive things.
Deceptive things by blowing up, had blown up aircraft and ships and everything else in Kent to look like it was going to be an invasion of our forces by Calais. So again, we see God's hand of protection. Of course, a huge number of British and American troops and Canadian troops and Commonwealth troops lost their lives fighting for the freedom. But we also have to make a distinction that this was essentially, as Hugh has mentioned, that we're fighting an Antichrist spirit and absolutely demonic forces. And had Hitler conquered Britain, we know that this would have been a fundamental attack on Christianity, because he wanted to rid Germany of its Christian ideals and identity and install a kind of pagan religion in its place.
Well, it was pagan, and anyway, I think already, wasn't it? And that was sort of evident to people, and the evil behind it was evident to people as well. I think that one thing to remember as well is that the commanders, like the generals, like Montgomery, in his final command, I think, to the troops, asked them to call on God or to seek God's help for this time. The sense of Christianity being around, and Churchill, one of my chapters on Churchill, so often referenced Christian civilization and the defense of Christian civilization in terms of how he saw it and how he presented it, how he understood it, and quoted the Bible quite a lot of times in his speeches and letters, and so on. And so this sense of the nation depending on Christianity, but also defending Christian principles and Christian freedoms against an evil and oppressive regime was very much evident and very much part of the motivation that did cause people to lay down their lives, which is what we remember for today. And we're grateful for the sacrifice that was made by these people to lay down their lives for freedom that we still enjoy and have today by God's grace and mercy.
Absolutely. And Hugh, it was my grandfather's generation, probably your father's generation, that showed incredible sacrifice. They didn't want to be known as heroes. They just thought we're just getting on with our job and just doing a job. And there's something very, very special about that generation. Can you share with us how special that generation was who fought for our freedoms during the Second World War?
Well, my own father was in the British Army. He was at the Battle of El Alamein, and after he passed away, I received a daily light book that had belonged to him, and he wrote notes in it. Certainly in those days, he did actually have a living faith in the Lord, and I think that was the case with a lot of people in the British Army back in those days, and he was a churchgoer to the end of his life.
Yeah. And Tim, when we look at today's crisis, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's the kind of climate change that our world is obsessed about, it's important to make our leaders, our prime ministers and our monarchy realise that without God's intervention, without God's help, everything else is futile, is it not?
Well, I think that's true, and I think that as a nation we've kind of forgotten that, and we've kind of trying to erase God from the picture in politics and in all of these things, and we need to bring him back. And that's part of the purpose of the book, is to bring God back into the picture of things and say, actually, unless we turn to God, what hope do we have? And things could get worse. And I do wonder if God is actually using these things to try and turn us back to him. The whole COVID thing forced us to stay in our homes and reflect for a bit, didn't it?
Absolutely.
And there were stories at one point of many people tuning into church services, many more than would normally have done so, through that time. And I wonder whether God is using these kind of crises and things to say, look, don't you think you need to turn back to me? Don't you need to come back to me? And I think that, I hope that we will one day. I hope that we will, and I want God to call us back, and I think that's God's intention, is to bring us back to him. We're trying to remind people that, hey, if, as it says in 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then God will heal their land. And that verse actually comes straight after a reminder of in times of pestilence, like COVID. If my people, so it applies throughout history, and it applies today. If we as God's people and as a nation turn to God in prayer, he can have mercy and will have mercy and heal our land. And surely our land needs healing today. You just look at the news, our land surely needs healing.
Absolutely. So Tim, for anyone watching this programme who's been inspired by this programme, how can they get hold of your book?
Yes, it's available on Amazon and Christian online bookshops as well. So Google it, go and find it. It's available, or go to our Wilberforce Publications website, and you'll find the links there as well. And it's quite easily obtainable. So yeah, and it's £15, which is incredibly good value, I think, for this.
Absolutely. So Hugh, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Politics Day. Also, Tim, thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you for this amazing book that you've written as well.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme as we mark Remembrance Day, and we remember the fallen. We remember those who have sacrificed their lives in defence of our religious freedoms that we enjoy today. And this book is such an important reminder that history is his story and that God is sovereign. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.